On behalf of all my sisters, it is with great joy that I welcome all of you to our community's third lecture in this year of the Carmelite Order celebration of the 5th centenary of St. Teresa's birth. We are always glad to see so many of you here for our lectures because it is certainly one of the ways we can share our spirituality and tradition of Carmelite prayer that St. Teresa left to us, not only to us, but to our church and, of course, to the wider world.
We are delighted to welcome Dr. Alison Weber with us. Some of us have known her and read her work for quite a number of years. She's one of a group of women scholars who has really done so much wonderful, wonderful work on Teresa and made a terrific contribution to the Carmelite Order, actually, and to all of us who treasure Teresa's writings and works. Teresa's writings, as many of you realize, I think, along with those of John of the Cross, are the very foundation and inspiration of our lives as Carmelites. But they also, as Judy said, foster the desire of many spiritual seekers for intimacy and for communion with God. Moreover, they're very important for anyone who is studying Spanish literature. John of the Cross is really one of the greatest poets of the Spanish language. Dr. Weber received her bachelor's and master's degrees in Spanish from the University of Berkeley, and her PhD in comparative literature from the University of Illinois. And I think this combination, this background, explains her interests and her expertise as well. Since about 1985, as I can figure it out, she's been publishing her research on Teresa of Avila and on topics that are related to Teresa, to Spain, to women. The Rhetoric of Femininity was truly a groundbreaking work when it came out. It's here if any of you want to look at it. I'm not really selling it, but maybe I am. It's really a terrific work. The novices just finished reading it, Celia and Olivia, whom some of you know, and they said, I had them read it after we studied the life. And they said, why didn't you have us read it before we studied the life? And I said, because you wouldn't really appreciate it until you studied the life. I said, now you can go back and read the life again with a new vision. But it's really a very wonderful book. The majority of Dr. Weber's studies and articles have appeared between 2003 and the present, and they're in Spanish and in English. You should look up her Vita to get a real view of this. Recently, when I contacted her, she was leaving to give a lecture in Salamanca, Spain. So, and some of her really intriguing essays, which I can't resist mentioning to you, different ones than one on the flyer. These are articles: Literature by Women Religious in Early Modern Catholic Europe and the New World, Gender and Mysticism. Doesn't that sound good? The Jesuits and the Discalced Carmelites, Friendship, Rivalry, and Suspicion. I'm really interested in that because, you know, Brian McDermott and I are working on the Jesuits and the Carmelites, so that's to come in September. Could Women Write Poetry? The Literary Daughters of St. John of the Cross, Little Angels, Young Girls in Discalced Carmelite Reform. And then she's done work on Anna St. Bartholomew and Maria of St. San Jose. Both were disciples, prioresses, while Teresa was still alive. And the last one that I wanted to mention, The Paradoxes of Humility. St. Teresa, the book of her life as double-blind. So that gives you some idea of where she's coming from, what you might expect, and really how exciting her work is. So we're very privileged to have Dr. Alison Weber with us today. So please join me in welcoming her among us.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Connie, for that very warm introduction. I don't think I've ever gotten a laugh from a title of one of my articles. That's fun. I decided to go back to the book of her life and to do something today that may strike you as very literary or very philological. But as we had a conversation over lunch about how difficult it is to read the book of her life, and how it seems as if Teresa is wondering why she's contradicting herself. How can we make heads or tails of this? And this is a problem I've struggled with for now over 30 years. But every once in a while, some light goes on, and you see the thread and where it's going. So I'd like to ask for your patience as I take you through some rather close readings of passages of the book of her life. So, words, words, words. Who decides on the meaning of a word? The editors of the Oxford English Dictionary, the members of the Royal Academy of the Language in Madrid. Although we may have a purist streak, and I inherited one from my mother who bristled every time she heard the word irregardless, ultimately, semantics are very democratic. Meaning is negotiated over time by usage. This has never stopped people from arguing over semantics. And indeed, from rhetorical manuals of the classical period to present-day handbooks on debating, defining the terms or taking control of semantics has always been to one's advantage in any argument. Teresa of Avila never studied rhetoric, that we know, but she was an avid reader with access to a good library, her father's library. She was an eager autodidact with extensive contacts with learned men. Preaching was another medium through which Teresa may have familiarized herself with the semantics of disputation. But my purpose in this talk is not to speculate on how Teresa became a good rhetorician, but to explore how she used semantic arguments to defend what she saw as a divinely authorized mission to found a Reformed convent, a mission that she saw as the effect of the experience of grace. To do so, she needed to explain how the men who opposed this reform and questioned the authenticity of her visions, voices, and ecstasy were wrong, how they had misunderstood key concepts of the spiritual life. And in Spanish, they are discreción, demonio, y deleite, discretion, the devil, and delight. An analysis of Teresa's dissonant semantics not only reveals her rhetorical skill, but I think it provides an opening into the evolution of her thinking about ecclesiastical authority, the discernment of spirits, the role of corporal penitence, and the action of grace. I'm talking about a Teresa whose theology has not been fully formed at a particular moment in the trajectory of her life when she's still thinking about how she can make the world as it should be. There's another Teresa who is more willing to accommodate acting in the world as it is. So I begin with the book of her life, and as probably very familiar to most of you, it was written between 1562 and 1565, this is the book of her life is not a modern autobiography. We live in a very narcissistic time, and everyone thinks that her life is special and that everyone else would be interested in reading it. This obviously was not the case in 16th century Spain. Only very important people wrote the story of their life. So we have to understand what kind of literary genre, what kind of autobiography it was. And it's been called an autobiography on command. That is a group of Teresa's confessors and a devout layman who basically were fond of her, basically were on her side, but also were very nervous about her spirituality. This group of men ordered her to write her method of prayer, to explain her method of prayer. They wanted to make sure that she wasn't an alumbrada, that she wasn't a philo-Protestant, and that she was not deluded. And I don't think they ever really thought she was a fraud, but they wanted to make sure that other people didn't think she was a fraud. But what does Teresa do with this command? She transforms it. And she transforms it according to very different kinds of genres. She had just read Augustine's Confessions, and this gives her another idea of writing the story of her life, which will reveal all her weakness, all her human errors, but that will also be exemplary and can be useful for other people. In other words, she's transforming this kind of judicial examination into an exemplary Augustinian confession. And Teresa had a great compulsion to teach. And I think maybe this is why I've always been so fascinated with Teresa, because my mother says that when I was a little girl, I used to line my dolls up and teach them. I think this is something that I share with Teresa, this compulsion to teach. Of course, women were not supposed to teach in mid-16th century Spain, but Teresa was able to fold in a manual on mental prayer into this autobiography command. Another thing that we have to bear in consideration, thinking about the life, is that the way it's like a palimpsest, that is, the time when people wrote on parchment was very expensive. And if you had something new to write and you only had old parchment, you would write over it. But then in time, you can see the previous writing bleeding through. And so I think when we read the book of her life, we can think of it as this kind of parchment where you're hearing different versions and different voices. And sometimes it's very difficult to figure out who exactly Teresa is writing to at that particular moment. But in general, I can say that she writes to her confessors in the plural, and you hear this very clearly in the prologue. She calls them vuestras mercedes, who have given her the command to write about the favors and the kind of prayer granted to her. But I will be focusing more on the moments when Teresa writes to a single addressee, a vuestra merced, and she also calls him mi padre, my father, mi hijo, my son, and sometimes she teases him, sometimes she instructs him. Although Teresa does not mention him by name, we have identified this intimate, receptive reader as Garcia de Toledo. He was born in the same year as Teresa, in 1515. Toledo belonged to the upper mobility. He was one of the younger sons of the family of the Counts of Oropesa. As a recently ordained Dominican, he served in the retinue of Don Antonio de Mendoza, the Viceroy of Spain. This is an indication that he is really up high in the aristocracy. He became Teresa's confessor in 1562, and this was a critical year in her life. And this was the year in which her spiritual advisors withdrew the support for her plan to found San Jose de Avila, the Reformed convent. Rumors circulated in Avila that Teresa was either a fraudulent prophetess, she had, after all, claimed that God told her to found this convent, or deceived by the devil. Such was the scandal that the Carmelite provincial had to get Teresa out of town. So he spirited her away to Toledo to take refuge in the house of another very high noble woman, Doña Luisa de la Cerda. And there is when Teresa meets Garcia de Toledo again. And I'm going to read this passage at length because I think it shows you how important he was for Teresa, how he was her soulmate. Once, when attending Mass at a monastery of his order near the place where I was staying, there came over to me a desire to know the condition of his soul, since I wanted him to be a great servant of God. And I rose to go to speak to him. She describes how she gets up, sits down, gets up, sits down 3 times, gets up to go over to see him, and then finally she says, "The good angel prevail." I went to call him, and he came to speak to me in the confessional. We began to question each other, for it was many years since we had met, about our lives. I began to tell him I had experienced many trials of the soul. He strongly urged me to tell him what the trials were. I told him they were not meant to be known, nor was meant that I should speak of them. The fact is that neither was it in his power to stop pressing me, nor was it in mine, it seems to me, to resist speaking about them. For despite the displeasures and shame I usually felt when I spoke about these things, I didn't feel any pain with him. Rather, I was much consoled. I told him about them under the seal of confession. I considered what wonderful talents and gifts he had for doing much good, were he to give himself totally to God. I've experienced this for some years. As soon as I see a person who greatly pleases me, with longings I sometimes cannot bear, I want to see him give himself totally to God. He asked me to pray earnestly to God for him. I went to the place where I usually prayed, and I said to His Majesty, "Lord, you must deny me this favor. See how this individual is fit to be our friend." This is an extraordinary description. First, note that Teresa initiates the encounter because she says she wanted to know the condition of Toledo, so she wanted him to become a great servant of God. Note that the encounter is described first as a conversation. The conversation becomes a sacramental confession. Why? Because this is the only way Teresa can disobey her current confessor's order not to scribe for spiritual favors. The confession brings consolation, but it also reinforces Teresa's longing to see Toledo give himself totally to God, essentially to convert him from a state of lukewarm Christianity to wholehearted Christianity. What seems most important to Teresa's narration is the fact that Toledo asked her to pray for him, and that she did so, bringing the priest into her friendship with God. So I think she's setting up the confessional relationship as a 3-way friendship, an egalitarian 3-way friendship. Thus, although there are multiple addressees in the life, the addressee who matters is Toledo. As I said before, she calls him my son, my father, the one to whom I have entrusted my soul. He's her editor. She invites him to tear up or laugh at whatever seems wrong or foolish. He is clearly not a sententious judge, but almost a disciple. She urges him to pay attention to one point or another and reminds him of her experience in spiritual matters. She says, "And since I have a lot of experience of this, I shall say something for the sake of informing your reverence." I think that's the bossy voice of Teresa that comes through when you least expect it. It was this confidence that Toledo was her soulmate and receptive pupil that permitted Teresa to write for him a guide for guiding souls, to teach him the true meaning of discretion, devil, and delight. I am getting to those three words. The paradox at the heart of this play, as we shall see, is that for Teresa, at least for this moment, at this moment in her spiritual career, is that true confession and a confessor, true discretion in a confessor resides in his willingness to suspend judgment while accompanying the penitent in her own process of self-discernment. So we get to discretion. Teresa's more erudite contemporaries would have inherited from the late Middle Ages the idea that discretion was a near synonym for prudence, a cardinal virtue. The Jesuits in particular used discretion alternatively with mediocritas to indicate the Aristotelian notion that virtue lies between two extremes. Thus, true generosity is the medium, the golden mean between avarice on the one hand and prodigality on the other. Second, by the mid-16th century, discretion had acquired the connotation of circumspection, being heedful of circumstances or consequences. Discretion, like prudence, was increasingly being drawn into an ethics-free zone of worldly wisdom, where a careful regard for one's own interest might trump transparency and obviate sincerity. Third, I would point out that Ignatius of Loyola, in the spiritual exercises, uses the word discretion to describe the wisdom and experience necessary to distinguish divine favors from demonic illusions. In the life, Teresa plays with the slippage between these meanings. In chapter 6, she reproaches herself for her exuberant devotion to Saint Joseph. If a person who had authority for writing, if I were a person who had authority for writing, I would willingly and in a very detailed way enlarge upon what I am saying about the favors of this glorious saint did for me. But so as to do no more than what they gave me a command to do, I will be briefer in many manners than I desire, more extensive in others than necessary. And of course she was more extensive most of the time. In some, like one who has little discretion in anything that is good. Basically, Teresa is confessing her failure to observe the golden mean. But as she does often in the life, her speech act is at once a mea culpa and a defense, an apologia. Teresa's immoderation is due to her irrepressible love for her fellow Christians. She manages to proselytize for St. Joseph and apologize for proselytizing at the same time. But it is also her way to express her disagreement with the idea that moderation is necessarily and always a virtue. Sometimes immoderation or enthusiasm is permissible, or at least pardonable. Teresa also uses discretion negatively in the following passage. She's talking about the need for confessors to hold their penitents back, at least in the first stages of prayer. But she says, if there had been anyone to encourage me to soar higher, I would have turned the desires to serve God into deeds more quickly. But on account of our sins, so few and so rare are the spiritual masters who are not excessively discreet in these matters that I believe it is one of the main reasons why beginners do not advance more rapidly to high perfection. And I love the way she describes this frustration about being held back. I think it's a metaphor from falconry, you know. If I had had someone que me sacara a volar, who had taken me out to let me fly, it makes you think of a falcon who is hooded or tied up and then is released. Here, Teresa has embedded a complaint within a paradox. Although she recognizes the importance for a good confessor to restrain a penitent's apostolic zeal or emotions, she allows that she has also suffered from confessors who restrained her with too much discretion. If only her confessors had allowed her soul to soar, si hubiera quien me sacara a volar, her desires to serve God would have borne fruit sooner. Her spiritual directors, precisely because they were rigidly moderate, had been too discreet, and therefore had impeded the realization of works that were the fruit of prayer. In chapter 23, Teresa describes a period in which her advisors, the pious layman Francisco de Salcedo and Gaspar Tafa, a secular priest from Avila, had determined that what she had experienced as divine communications were demonic delusions. Although Teresa eventually was reconciled to these two men, she does not hide her wounded disappointment in them, as she gives the following advice to Toledo. Discretion is necessary, especially with women, because our weakness is great, and a lot of harm could be done by telling us outright that the cause is the devil. But the matter should be considered carefully, and they should be turned aside from any dangers there might be, and they should be advised to keep these things secret, and their confessors, too, should be aware of the importance of secrecy, for it is very important. This is complicated syntax, I recognize, but I'm going to try to unravel it. Salcedo and Daza had not proceeded with discretion. On the contrary, they had leaked news of Teresa's problematic favors, provoking the scandal that threatened the plans to found San Jose. Teresa continues, well, I'm saying that one should counsel these souls, and she's speaking about women's souls, with great discretion, encouraging them and biding one's time until the Lord helps them as he did me. Okay, so the way you help these souls is holding back and waiting. If I had not been so treated, the greatest harm would have been done to me because I was frightened and scared. With the serious heart trouble I had, I'm amazed that much damage wasn't done to me. Although these passages appear to echo the misogynistic tropes of women's emotional and intellectual weakness, which makes them susceptible to demonic illusion, Teresa twists that and reveals that she is not referring to emotional, but to physical weakness. Considering her heart trouble, she implies it's a miracle that Daza and Salcedo's lack of discretion hadn't frightened her to death. Their lack of discretion consisted in their inability to keep things secret, and their jump to the conclusion that the favors had to be demonic. Teresa gives yet another example of a disappointing confessor. In 1558, Teresa began to make confessions to Baltasar Alvarez, a recently ordained Jesuit. Alvarez was not a contemplative, he had never experienced the prayer of quiet, and he was skeptical of her favors. Like Salcedo and Daza, he initially promised to help her with founding the Reformed convent, but he withdrew his support under public pressure. Teresa was especially disappointed with Alvarez, who not only refused to believe her revelations, but also forbade her to speak to anyone about them. He essentially cut her off from other confessors. In chapter 28, she describes him as follows. He was very discreet and deeply humble, and this humility that was so great brought upon me many trials. For since he was a learned and very prayerful man, and the Lord didn't lead him by this path, he didn't trust in himself. He suffered many great trials in many ways on my account. I knew that they told him to be careful of me, that he shouldn't let the devil deceive him by anything I told him. They brought up examples to him of other persons. I feared that I would have no one who would hear my confession, but they would all run from me. I did nothing but weep. I think the emotional tone of this passage is very complex. I perceive at the same time Teresa's forgiveness, she was a very forgiving person, and even her pity for Alvarez, but also she was hurt. This passage, as a speech act, it also contains something of a backhanded compliment. Alvarez was not a man of discretion. His learning hadn't helped his powers of discernment. His humility wasn't helpful. His humility was a lack of confidence. It was spiritual timidity. It is ironic that Alvarez, a Jesuit, plays the role of the indiscreet confessor in a guidebook for Toledo, a Dominican, because Teresa's model for the confessor-penitent relationship is basically that of the spiritual exercises, in which the exercise giver's central task is to help the exercitant learn self-discernment and to help him, or less often her, recognize that demonic temptations may be part of the process. They may be signs of spiritual progress because the devil tempts, as the exercises say, by disquieting with false arguments so that the soul will not go forward. Was Teresa trying to teach Toledo to be a good Jesuit? Teresa eventually persuaded Alvarez to support the foundation, and their subsequent relationship was harmonious. She refers to him in a letter written shortly before his death in 1580 as one of the best friends I have. He is a saint. I must note another irony. Alvarez later came to practice a form of prayer of quiet very similar to Teresa's, and in fact, he was sharply disciplined for teaching this form to others. Discretion is thus a hinge between two other key words I want to explore today. As she does with discretion, Teresa attempts to displace a mistaken understanding of demonio, the devil. The understanding of the devil that Teresa tries to displace is that of Paul's second epistle to the Corinthians, the demon who disguises himself as an angel of light. She does not deny that this can happen, but she does argue that this disguised devil is not as ubiquitous or pernicious as many feared. Furthermore, Teresa wants to show how the devil deceives. It is not his angelic appearance that is dangerous, but his ability to evoke sensations of indiscreet, excessive humility. This was the most terrible trick of the devil. This was the most terrible trick the devil could play on me under the guise of humility. That seeing myself so corrupted, I began to fear the practice of prayer. It seemed to me that, since in being wicked I was among the worst, it was better to go the way of many, to recite what I was obliged to vocally and not practice mental prayer and so much intimacy with God, for I merited to be with the devil. The devil tempts practitioners of mental prayer to abandon it. He infuses fear of spiritual friendship between men and women. He confuses the soul so that it cannot distinguish physical illness from spiritual dryness. But the most insidious trick of the devil is to take advantage of the excessive discretion of confessors. In the chapters in which Teresa describes the contradictions of her spiritual advisors, the allusions to the devil multiply. But so do affirmations of her confidence in self-discernment and divine protection. A fig for all the devils, because they shall fear me. I don't understand these fears. The devil, when we can say God, God, and make the devil tremble. Without a doubt, I fear those who have such great fear of the devil more than I do the devil himself, for he can't do anything to me, whereas these others, especially if they are confessors, cause severe disturbance. I have undergone some years of such great trials that I am amazed now at how I was able to suffer. I don't mean to suggest that the devil for Teresa was simply a psychological concept rather than a metaphysical entity. But as I've argued elsewhere, she downplayed the devil's agency, and she saw the demonic more as an aggravating force that took advantage of mental illness and ordinary human weaknesses, pride, vanity, the hunger for attention. The devil was an exacerbator rather than a prime cause. A third word that will get, unfortunately, short shrift in this paper is deleite, or delight. The fact that Teresa employs it 44 times in the life, and its semantic siblings gotho, or joy, and gothar, to rejoice, appear 27 and 76 times respectively, is remarkable. Not only because deleite had, although less than in modern Spanish, connotations of sensuality, it would be the delights of human love are described as deleites, and gozar had sexual overtones. But joy was considered a distinctive theme among the alumbrados in the 1520s and 30s and the Philo-Protestants of the 1550s. It was associated in the Inquisition's eyes with disbelief in hell and purgatory and confidence in salvation through the benefits of Christ. And alumbradismo, or luminism, was kind of a catch-all term for many different diffuse spiritual movements. And in the 1550s, the Inquisition was especially, they were called, Teresa calls them tiempos recios, dangerous times, because the Inquisition is basically paranoid about any expression that does not fit into a rather narrow definition of orthodoxy. Deleite presented the same problem as visions and locutions. Was this joy, was this delight, a delusion of the devil? Teresa concedes that the devil does have the power to produce pleasure and delight. She says gusto y deleite. But as in the case of visions, she insists that the experienced soul will be able to discern this. Furthermore, the devil can do little harm or none at all if the soul directs to God the delight and sweetness it feels and fixes its thoughts and desires upon him. The devil can't gain anything, rather he will lose much. For this delight will prompt the soul to return often to prayer with longing for the Lord. Yes. When the devil sees that in this consolation the soul humbles itself, he will not return often because he sees his loss. As she would state more boldly in the Book of Foundations with an analogy to painting, the source of a vision or a delight is less important than its effect. Whenever we see a representation of our Lord, it is right for us to reverence it, even if it has been painted by the devil himself. She says, the devil is a great painter, and in wanting to do us an evil deed, he rather does us a good one if he paints a crucifix or another image so lifelike that it leaves an image engraven on our hearts. The devil, the Pauline devil disguised as an angel of light, paradoxically could produce good effects. Teresa's further challenge was to affirm the legitimacy of emotions of joy and delight while severing them from a false assurance of salvation. The problem was that during the prayer of quiet, Teresa's experience was that God's love did produce, as she says, confidence and the feeling of security that the soul will not fall away from what it enjoys. So how to distinguish security or confidence from a heretical surety of salvation. And her solution was to redefine the effects of delight as confidence, not in salvation, but confidence that God never tires of giving, nor can he exhaust his mercies. Confidence in the continuity of God's love and forgiveness. Despite Teresa's repeated affirmations that the practitioner of mental prayer must look for direction from discreet confessors, be moderate in her spiritual aspirations, and circumspect in speaking and acting, her semantics at this moment in her spiritual life reveal a soul who trusts more in self-discernment than in the discernment of most men, who has accepted the legitimacy of delighting in God's love, and who does not fear demonic deception. This is the Teresa confident and daring, we might say reckless, considering that 3 years earlier, 3 years before Teresa poured out her soul to Garcia de Toledo, her friend Ana Enriquez was penanced by the Inquisition and Valladolid for espousing so-called Lutheran errors, and 15 others were burned. Teresa was 47 when she finished the life. On a note of triumph, San Jose de Avila had been founded. She was a mature woman, but she had not yet confronted the challenge of administration or had much experience with nuns who were not very good at self-discernment. In future works, especially in the Book of Foundations and the letters, there are more allusions to discretion as a necessary survival tool in a world of rivalry and rancor. There's also a greater recognition of the need for direction from genuinely discreet persons, whether prioresses or confessors. As Teresa goes beyond her role as foundress of one convent and becomes the leader of a reform movement, she becomes more circumspect. The pardonable enthusiasm for severe penitential practices is tempered, as she sees that indiscreet penances can produce melancholy. But in the vida, the life, perhaps buoyed by the euphoria of discovering a soulmate in Garcia de Toledo, perhaps trusting in the protection of powerful nobles like Doña Luisa de la Cerda, perhaps trusting that the Church might yet allow for a more capacious theology of joy, Teresa dares to be indiscreet. Thank you.
Yes. You spoke about her confessors in the plural.
Yes.
Was it appropriate at that time for somebody to have confessors, regular people that they regularly went to confession?
Yes.
I haven't heard that. Why do they do that?
Well, I don't know.
These have the confession and keep going.
Yeah. In some cases, they were serial confessors, and in the case of the Jesuits, she really, for the most part, recognized the importance of the confessors. They would be transferred to other places.
Okay. They were serial confessors.
Yes.
They weren't at the same time.
Yes, but in the case of Daza and Salcedo was really a layman, and we do, when she refers in the prologue, she refers to my confessors as Nuestras Mercedes. So you really do have the feeling that maybe they're not taking her sacramental confession, but they are consulting with each other. Teamwork. Joanne?
You have written about teaching Teresa and the
Yes.
Spanish mystics. Would you say a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, this was a volume of essays that I edited for the Modern Language Association. I'm teaching Teresa of Avila and the Spanish mystics. And there were contributions from all sorts of disciplines, from history departments, from the music colleges, women's studies, and so forth. And it was fascinating to see how these different disciplines also, who were speaking to different student audiences. Some were teaching in Catholic colleges, others in enormous state universities. And yet all of them had found ways to, that the works of Teresa and also John of the Cross and Gregory's de Leon could be made accessible to undergraduate students. It's a challenge. Yes.
Well, when I thought I finished reading the life, I came upon 11 relations at the back. And I had to read through those. Could you kind of describe the relationship between the 11 relations and the life itself?
Right. Well, periodically, Teresa's confessors would have her write a description of her spiritual experiences as a particular moment. So the book of her life is, as I said, a kind of palimpsest. In some ways, she's rewriting these previous relations, but I think that everything becomes refocused when she meets Garcia de Toledo.
May I ask you to broaden the lens a little bit and tell us from all of your research on Teresa what you think are the most important lessons for women in the church?
The spiritual equality of women, confidence in women's ability to read scripture, the right of women to be of service to the church. And that was her great frustration in this period, that the gifts of God, she felt, had to result in works, in obras, and there was no outlet for that. And so she really invented an apostolate of prayer. She knew she couldn't go out. She knew that given her class, given her her background, the fact that she already was a vowed nun, she couldn't go out into the world. But what she could do is she could make convents into a prayer tank. And through spiritual friendships, through prayer for the church, not just for your immediate patrons, that she could be useful.
I'm curious about her interest in St. Joseph, and if she wrote about her understanding of what he was, and its relevance in her life, in her life.
Yes, yes. I don't know. If I were in a more psychoanalytic mood, I would talk about St. Joseph as the ideal father figure. She did love her father. St. Joseph is also gains importance in the Counter-Reformation. There are many more paintings of St. Joseph, and he becomes a figure of the ideal Christian man who is gentle and tempered and who works. So she may have seen him as well. A little more speculative, knowing Teresa's converso background, it may have been a way of acknowledging the continuity of Judaism and Christianity, but that's very speculative.
Especially during this season of Lent, when we're praying, what guidance or what would you suggest that we would ask St. Teresa to intercede on our behalf for?
What do you think? What do you
Well, I know she's noted as the patroness. I heard that you pray to her for headache. She's noted as like the patroness of headaches.
Yes.
Okay. So I guess, you know, if there's stresses in our lives,
Yes.
or, like you said, and the lady in the front had asked the impression she's made, or what you think of as far as maybe women becoming a little more active in their roles in the church, maybe that's something.
Yes, yes, for knowing your vocation in the broadest sense. Teresa might have said, what does God want me to do? Tell me.
Teresa was clearly confident in the validity of our experience. Can you pinpoint the time when that occurred, that confidence emerged?
When her confidence emerged, 1562. Yeah, I think Garcia de Toledo. There may have been other things before then, but it was that relationship that gave her the confidence that friendship, spiritual friendship was key. And this is another connection, I think, with the Jesuits. For all her self-confidence, she didn't want to go it alone, and I think it was extremely important to have that.
I really think, even though it took 500 years for the Carmel to open up, this itself is a celebration here.
Yes.
That we come, you know, and worship with them, and I think it's a step forward. But, you know, when you read about how many billions of years it took to create the world, it's pretty good.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I think she did as exasperated as she was about some of her confessors. She did an awful lot for establishing communication between men and women in the church. She had to, you know, speculate, but they got the message.
How right were you when she was that women were not really taught Latin and everything was trapped into it?
I don't think anger would be the word. I would say frustration. And, you know, there are lots of myths that surround Teresa and sayings that attributed to her. And one of them is that one nun comes to a convent, she has her own Bible. And she sends her away and says, you know, go away, sister, we don't need bachilleras, and bring their own Bibles. I think she was careful that nuns should not appear to teach too openly, but she found lots of ways around it. And even though she criticizes confessors who rely too much on learning, the letrados sin experiencia, the letrados who had no experience of prayer, her ideal confessor was someone who combined both, who had the learning and also the experience. And so she really did, I think, have a respect for learning. And you can read in the constitutions a list of books that she wanted each convent to have. And she wanted nuns who were admitted to the Carmel to know how to read, which sometimes, you know, was slim pickings, but she wanted them at least to have the beginnings of literacy. And once they were in the convent, they had many more opportunities to improve their literacy. We have the case of yes, yes, yes. Few of the early Carmel knew Latin. The exception was Maria de San Jose.
See, Teresa comes from Jewish converso background. It's my understanding that most convents at the time would not accept women of converso background. And she wanted her Carmels, her monasteries to do that, but that there was a politics to that, and eventually that the ability to accept conversos was removed from the possibility for Carmel. Can you speak to that politics, that background?
Jody Billencoff, I think, in her book on the Avila of St. Teresa, explains this very well. Attitudes towards conversos were very local, and they, if you go to Andalusia, there's a lot of prejudice against conversos. Not so much in Avila. And her family and other converso families were pretty much integrated. But the patronage of the convents was controlled by old Christian upper bourgeoisie. And so one of the reasons that Teresa wanted to found convents without this connection, without renta, was that she could tap into alms and contributions from this converso merchant class, and she didn't have to have security as well. And so there were a lot of conversos in those early convents, and it wasn't until after her death, until I think 1590, or maybe even a little later, that period of blood statutes were imposed.
Alison, does everybody know what conversos are?
No. Conversos are converts. There are Moorish conversos, but it generally refers to converts from Judaism and their descendants. So there were a number of university organizations, municipalities, who imposed purity of blood statutes. This means that you had to prove that you had no Jewish blood 4 generations back. And the whole a number of the religious orders adopted them, but the Jesuits and the Carmelites held out until the end of the century.
Am I right in thinking that they were Jews were forced to become Christians? Jews were forced to become Christians, isn't that so?
Well, that's another semantic question. There have been mass conversions at the end of the 14th century as a result of pogroms. And so the Jewish community was significantly diminished throughout the 15th century. In 1492, Isabel and Fernando issued a decree saying that the Jews had 6 months to either decide to convert or go into exile. So there were not forced